This lesson is create custom validations by inheriting from the validation attribute class. The objectives for this lesson are to learn the validation attribute class, create 3 classes. One to validate a date is greater than a set value, validate a date is less than a set value, and validate a date is between 2 different years. So the validation attribute class, all data annotation attribute classes inherit from this, and this class supplies all the error message properties. It has all the methods to format error message strings, check for validity of data. Now this is an abstract class, so when we're going to create our own data annotation attribute, we need to inherit from this class. So let's create our first validation class that is to check if a date is greater than a minimum date. Right mouse click on the validation classes folder and let's add a new class called date minimum attribute. Into this file, we're going to place just a little bit of code. It's not too bad, but this is pretty standard code for creating one of these validation attribute classes. So I create a public class called date minimum attribute. Always add the suffix attribute on this. That follows the same naming standard that Microsoft uses. We inherit from validation attribute. We're going to pass in however many parameters we need to pass in our constructor of our attribute. So in this case, I only need a minimum date. You can see on line 12, I've created a private read-only date time called _min_date. I take that string that's passed in and I do a convert dot to date time on that and put it into that private variable so that I can use it throughout the rest of this class. Now, obviously I haven't put a lot of error handling in, so make sure you do add that to check to make sure something is a valid date before you try to convert it. You can now see down here, the isValid method is the one that we have to override on the validation attribute class. It's going to return a validation result. It passes in an object, because whatever that object is that we attach it to, and it's also going to pass in the validation context. We check to make sure the value is not equal to null. So whatever that value is that is put into the property that we're validating, make sure it's not null. Then we take that value and we convert it to a date time. And again, not a lot of exception handling in here. I'm just trying to get the point across of how you create one of these things. Then we want to get the display name for the validation message. So we do VC, validation context, dot display name. We can then check to see if the date entered is less than or equal to the minimum date set. So on line 27, that's where we're doing that logic. We then check to see if the error message property is filled in. So if it's string.null or is empty, let's fill in the error message with one that we create. So in this case, it's going to be display name must be greater than or equal to, and then there's our minimum date expressed as a mm/dd/yyyy. Again, feel free to use any of the other ones. You could use the lowercase d there to make sure something is localized. If we know that the date entered is less than or equal to that minimum date, we're going to go ahead and return a new validation result, passing in the error message, and then we create a new string array that we take that vc.member name, or if the member name is not available to us, the member name would be the property name, then we would do an unknown property. But that member name should always be pretty much filled in. If we don't return from there, we're going to return at the bottom here, and we're going to return a validation result dot success, which tells them that, hey, everything happened okay. So let's go back up now to our product class. Let's locate the discontinued date, and let's add our new date minimum attribute class on. Now you don't use the attribute portion, but this is how you do it. You do it just like we did with Microsoft's data annotations, date minimum, and then you pass in the date, right? 9/1/2023. If we then go back to program.cs and we replace now this customer with a product entity, and we look at line 17 here, discontinued date equals convert to date time 1/1/2020. That is less than what we're saying we want. So let's go ahead and run this and we'll see. There we go. Discontinued date must be greater than or equal to 9/1/2023 because that is what we passed in. Now you can even watch this happen if you want. Go ahead and set a breakpoint right inside of here and you'll be able to watch it happen real time. So you'll see the value that gets passed in. That's the one that we set in our product entity. And we can check and we can get that date entered as a real date. We grab the display name. So there you can see it's called discontinued space date because that's the display name that we put in. We then check to see if that date entered is less than that minimum date that we passed in the attribute. Check to see if an error message is filled in. It wasn't, so we build our own. And then we return that validation result, and thus it spits out that in the debug window there. Do you know why you should subscribe to YouTube channels? You'll get notifications when new videos appear. You'll get recommendations for related channels. It helps the channel grow, which allows me to create more videos for you. It helps attract others to my channel. Your like helps others find videos that are good. So please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, Paul D. Sheriff. Well, let's go ahead and create another class. It's going to be very similar to that one where we're going to check to make sure that a date is less than a maximum date that's entered. If it's outside of that, then it's going to give us the error. Right mouse click on the validation classes folder, and let's add another class now called date maximum attribute. Now this one is going to be almost identical to the date minimum. But you can see now what I'm doing is I'm passing in another date. I've called it max date in this case. And I've got a private read-only datetime _ max date. I still have the same isValid method that I'm overriding, but I do exactly the same code. It's only different down on line 25 where I'm checking now to make sure that the date entered, if it's greater than or equal to the max date, then I'm going to need to, post back a validation result with the error message that I'm putting in here. Otherwise, I'll return a success. So once again, let's do this. Let's open up our customer and let's put a date maximum here on our next billing date. And then what we'll do is in the program.cs, let's replace the product here with our customer. And let's go ahead and run this. And now you can see that that next billing date must be less than or equal to 12/31/2029. Let's create one more, and this is where we'll check for a minimum and a maximum date, but we're going to do it not like the range operator. We're going to put in numeric values to say from this date back a certain number of years and forward a certain number of years. Right mouse click on the validation classes folder and let's add a new class. This one will be called date year range attribute. And what we're going to do inside of this guy is write pretty familiar code. But as you can see on the constructor, I'm passing in two integer values, years prior and years after. I've created two private read-only values that are date time. I'm initializing those on lines 9 and 10, where I'm taking the years prior, which will pass in as a negative, and I'm doing a datetime.now.addYears -2, for instance. And then on the max date, I'm taking that datetime.now.addYears and I'm passing that in as a positive value, so maybe a 5. So that gives me my date range that now is not hard-coded. It moves with today's date. Now the isValid method, still the same type of thing, right? We grab the value and convert it to the date entered. We get the display name. And then on lines 26 and 27 is where we do our check. If date entered is less than the min date or the date entered is greater than the max date, then we need to do our error message. And you can see the error message there that I've built in is the display name, whatever that is, must be between the min date and the max date. We then return that as a validation result, and there we go. Very simple. So to get this to work, let's go into our product class. Let's locate our selling start date, and I'm going to put a range in of -2 years from today's date and a +5 years of today's date. We can then open the program.cs and replace the customer with a product entity, and then look at line 15. The sell start date is set to today's date, but adding -6 years. Remember I said you can only go back -2 years. So if I run this, I should get the error message. The selling start date must be between 01/16/2022 and 01/16/2029. In this lesson, we created 3 classes to validate dates. We did a greater than a specific date, we did a less than a specific date, and a date within 2 specified years, all by inheriting from the ValidationAttribute class. Coming up next, Create a custom compare validation class in C#.